Hello, welcome to Dialogue. I'm Han Dong in Beijing. On September the 29th, the Chinese government published a national action plan for the next 5 years on human rights protection. According to the document, China will combine human rights with economic, political, cultural and social progress. So, why has China released such a new action plan to promote human rights at the present moment? What are the major challenges? To discuss all these issues and more, today I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Victor Gao Zhikai, Director of the China National Association for International Studies, and Professor Zhu Ying from the Southwest University of Political Science and Law. Before we get started, let's take a look at this.
On Thursday, China published a national action plan on human rights protection for 2016 to 2020. According to the plan, the coming 5 years are said to be a decisive stage for China to build a moderately prosperous society. The government will improve standards of living and the quality of life, upgrade public services, and spare no effort in lifting people out of poverty. China will enforce the law in a strict, procedure-based manner and protect citizens' personal rights and dignity. It will improve socialist democracy, clear and expand channels for citizens' participation in political affairs, and ensure people's rights to be informed, to participate, and to be heard, and to oversee. The government will promote development in regions inhabited by ethnic minorities. It will endeavour to eliminate gender discrimination and strengthen the protection of rights and interests of minors. China will combine human rights education with national education in spreading knowledge of the law. China will also fulfil its obligations to international human rights conventions, furthering its involvement with UN human rights projects.
So let's talk about human rights in China. Gentlemen, human rights in China. 4 words that always make some Western governments and media organizations more than excited. As a result, China has faced many false accusations in this field. So now, if you had a chance to respond, what would be your strongest and foremost argument? Let's start with you, Professor.
Okay, you just mentioned that it's the most exciting topic and also a very obviously sometimes with question marks with sensitive topics, especially talking about the human rights concepts in China. But if you, I have to respond to firstly that we just put forward the new national action plan at this time. I think that we are not the first time to put forward these national plans, but we are the third turn to put forward this. It's not the first time, but I think it's the perfect time to put forward this, because when we review of the history of the United Nations has world conferences on the human rights in the 1993. We just put forward one of the declaration of the called Vienna Declaration of the Human Rights National Action Plan. At that time, according to the article, I remember that is 71 and part 2, the world conferences on the human rights strongly recommend that each state consider the desirable of drawing up the national action plan that identify a step whereby the state should provide the promotion and protection of human rights at that time. So after that time, the first to put forward the national program is Australia. And we just the first time to put out of this program in the 1999, but we as the island state just put the 3 terms of the national action plan in this world. And we just continue and persist into this. And so I should respond that the national action plan is not only the promise to all the citizens of Chinese, and also how about say a promise of the Chinese government, but it's a promise. And it's a very trusted promise that we can see and we can, how about say, monitoring and also evaluation in the future 5 years. So that will be a very big benefit for all the Chinese people.
Well, Victor, as Professor just said, the timing is perfect, and this is the 3rd such document in China. What's your interpretation of the timing?
Before I answer that question, let me come back to your first question. I think in the world today, no country should have a monopoly on human rights. Secondly, without human rights, no country can achieve modernization. And therefore, I think as mankind, we should all make concerted efforts to pursue and achieve and protect human rights. Now, China is not an exception. I think in China, the Chinese people attach great importance to human rights, even though different countries actually sometimes define human rights in different ways. In the United States, for example, the right to bear arms is enshrined in the Constitution. In the rest of the world, most of us will find such a kind of human right as a ludicrous idea. No one wants to have a society where human beings will own arms and use arms against the others. Therefore, I think whenever a country believes he has the total truth, he has the monopoly on human rights, and no other countries have the equivalent version of the human rights, that country is indulging in fantasy. Therefore, I think from the Chinese perspective, the Chinese people attach great importance to human rights. The Chinese government comes up with this kind of declaration or documents to make sure that the human rights are defined with the Chinese uniqueness. That is, human rights also include economic rights, development right, for example. And in this way, I think this document achieves the goal of differentiating human rights and tailor-make that to the circumstances in China, so that people in this country have the right to know about what exactly are their human rights, and what is the protection granted by the state and the government, and what is the legal procedure through which they can not only protect themselves, but also help the society at large to achieve greater protection for the human rights. And human rights are not just static, they are dynamic. They actually develop and evolve with the changes in the society, in the economy, for example. Therefore, this document in itself is not only timely, answering our second question, but also it evolves over the time. And eventually, I think the people in this country, the society at large, will have better awareness of their rights as citizens, as human beings. And we need to make concerted efforts to make sure that the human rights for the Chinese nation tomorrow will be better than they are today.
Yes,
so having said that, what impresses you most from this document, Professor?
Yes, I am sincerely agree with Dr. Victoria's idea about this new document. And so you just said that what's new in the document. I think that will be, it's a very universal and standard criteria according to the, maybe that is must be according to the United Nations, especially for the Human Rights Councils, which has recently suggested one of the standards for the, how to make the national action plan. And we also have provide more higher levels or standards than other countries. There are some very good ideas about.
Sorry, you were saying we are going to implement higher standards.
Yes.
Even higher than those Western countries like United States, Germany, or the United Kingdom.
Especially on some new kind of the human rights, such as on the new developments of the right of development. We always mention that we have the development on the economic, social, and the cultures. And we step from the one step and another, and we just come to a cultural step. For example, we just come to a new normal of the National Action Plan on the cultural rights for the citizens. For example, we just provide the all-citizen reading program in this document that will be improve and enrich the cultural levels of all the citizens before the 2020, especially on the internet learning model. That's very new and fresh idea around the world. And the second is we just come to the civil rights and the political rights. As usual, we usually say that we like to say that how many laws and regulations we have made in this year by the NPC or other legislative Congress or legislative organizations, or how to increase or how many regulations and how many rights we should protect and promote in our some of the civil or the criminal procedures laws. And now we do not very focus on these old traditional ways, but we focus on a very practical and realistic ways to increase the real rights of the citizens in China, and especially from the legal system model to the rule of law models now. And the third one is that we have a very good idea about the education human rights, or human rights. And
talking about that, it's very worth noticing that China is proposing that over the next 5 years, human rights knowledge will be introduced and included in the education of all schools at all levels. Is this a common practice for all the countries around the world?
Not necessarily in all the countries, but I would say that in more developed countries where human rights or rule of law have better or deeper tradition, yes, indeed, education about the human rights is absolutely a very important part of human rights itself. But it is also important to emphasize that human rights can have the theoretical aspect of it, but also equally, if not more importantly, the implementation part of that. Because it is easier actually to talk about human rights, but it is more difficult and more challenging to really provide enough protection to the human rights. And this will depend very much on the rule of law, on transparency, on independent judiciary, on the awareness of the people and the society at large about their rights and about the procedures and how the protections can be delivered to the ordinary people. You need to really combine these two. That is the theoretic and the academic aspect of the human rights with the implementation and the practice of human rights to come up with a more or less seamless combination of human rights in action and in practice. That is what I think China need to do. We, for many years, did not talk about human rights. Actually, we talked about other things. More recently, we talk a lot about human rights, and we attach more and more importance to human rights. But we also need to move on to match our talk with our walk, that is to achieve the transparency of the government, to eliminate corruption, for example, and to enshrine the rights in the documents, in the constitution, etc. But also, very importantly, to make sure that the judiciary is an independent judiciary and there is transparency and fairness and equity.
That's all about
in
rule
the
of law
justice.
in the country.
Absolutely.
And Professor, another point is that according to this action plan, China will establish a third-party assessment mechanism. Tell us, what's this all about?
Okay.
Who's eligible to conduct this third-party assessment?
The third-party assessment is based on, independent organization, especially for the thinking tanks, especially for the advanced national thinking tanks, because according to the handbook of the National Action Plan, the handbook which just published in the 2002, that will be many years ago, and we just increased the standards. And as we just mentioned that, I mentioned that it's best time or perfect time because it's a very close time that we just connected the idea of the human rights in China practice with a governance idea in this, the 13 5-year plan for our government. And the second, and we have put forward the 4 principles to test and examine the documents that will be fulfilled with the practice. In the practice, one is the principle of rule of law. The second will be the practical, realistic and action-oriented planning program. And the third will be the balance principles that will be the balance with cultural, civil, social rights between the political rights and also the individual rights and the collections rights. And also we have the principle of the equality. That will be we will treat the government, the organization, and other social NGOs, as well as some of the independent thinking tankers. So we just introduced some of the third independent organizations to exams. We just increased the one is of the initial evaluation before the new documents, and also terminates the evaluation and the final evaluation. We have, for example, for the last second term of the document, we have enjoined over 15 units, including the Department of Government, the judicials and legislation department, and also some of the groups, social organizations, academic institutes, For example, the Nankai University or Shandong University, and including our university, have joined us to evaluation the last letter of the documents and put
So
forward.
the Chinese government is not only serious about implementation, but also about results.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for input. We'll be getting back to you very soon. You're watching Dialogue on CCTV News. Stay with us. Welcome back to Dialogue. We're talking about China's just released human rights action plan. So, gentlemen, let's continue discussion. And according to this just released action plan, China will study the feasibility and the necessity to establish a national human rights institution. What will it look like, Professor?
Okay, the national human rights institution that will be do a very the first-hand investigation for the citizens to increase their human rights.
So is it a governmental organ,
No.
or is it a think tank?
No, it's an independent,
independent
the third part of the academic institutes that will be enjoying of some of all the resources in our Chinese university, especially which has already established the human rights centers or institute, because they have do some the formal investigation, such as maybe the public idea about the human rights, and some can provide some very constructive suggestions to the Chinese government, and also can supervise and do the evaluation. So you know that we have made some of the very good targets in until will be finished in the 2020, and that will be the same perfect match with the government's targets for the next 5 years plan. So you will find that especially on the help the poor program, such as like the poverty relief program, and that we should relieve some more than 50 million people in China that will be taken out from the level of the poor family. And one way is to put 30 million people into the new instruction creation ways, and another 10 million people into
and that
employment.
can be called one of the biggest improvements in human history, right?
Yes, of course. That's also the biggest achievement, and also a very big benefits for the Chinese people.
So, Victor, a third-party assessment mechanism and a possible national human rights institution. What do all this tell about China's human rights development?
I think these are all very important initiatives. In other countries, there are similar organizations or institutions. However, I would say by the end of the day, the taste of the pudding is in eating it. And therefore, we still need to come back to the practice and the implementation. And sometimes, for example, if you actually establish more and more such institutions, it may not be actually, in absolute terms, very helpful to achieve the end goal. We should consider other means, for example, empowering the media, which is very, very important. So the media should not only be tolerated, but actually being encouraged to be more proactive in identify human rights abuses, for example, and come up with very accurate and objective reporting about the process of providing remedy for violations of human rights. For example, if, for example, in practice, you actually try to contain media on the one hand, whereas you talk a lot about protection of human rights, and no matter how many institutions you set up, how big of a name you give to such institutions, eventually the end result will not be that satisfactory. Therefore,
What about individuals? Do you think individuals can work with the government together in the protection of human rights?
Absolutely. If you use the experience in the United States, where the black people eventually rose up and stood against the violations or the prejudices against the minorities, for example, it actually started with, in many cases, individual protections, protestations, for example. And in China, it's the same case. In more recent years, you actually have many different cases of abuses of human rights or injustice in the system, and then they were picked up by the system or they were picked up by the media, and individuals protested. In China, they lodged grievances. They tried to talk to the party organization, to the government, etc. And eventually, I think the society at large and the party and the government and the judiciary system, etc., all teamed in to deal with the problem as it is and come up with more philosophical ways of addressing these underlying issues. And I think we need to have, everyone being involved in talking about human rights, coming up with better suggestions and ideas, and eventually I think we have a more seamless framework of protection of human rights, and abuses of human rights need to be identified early in the process, and then remedies need to be delivered very quickly. Abuses need to be corrected, and people need to have confidence that the system works and the system is geared towards eliminating corruption and protecting the human rights of the people in China.
Well, gentlemen, as you all put it, it's a very good plan, and we know that human rights protection is a global issue. So how does China's action plan fit into the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, Professor?
Yes, we have sent out a lot of the targets, and according to according with regulations, the hope. And some of the targets will be can be seen and can be accountable, such as Dr. Gao said that some of the target is very tough, and we know that we should create some of the a strong environment or strong.
You said some
culture
targets are very tough. What's the toughest one?
Okay, let's talking about, for example, the right of the property. The right of property that we have maybe we try our best to finish the codification of the civil law in the 2020.
And you think it's the toughest?
That's
for
the toughest.
Both rural
one of
and
them.
urban residents.
Yes, one of them. And I think the toughest will be the poverty relief program will be in the 2020. And the other will be the right for the education. You know that we should get 90% of the person to get into the high school in the urban area, and 85% were in the rural area. And we also have we should lead to increase the average educational year to 10.8 years for every Chinese citizen. And as you're worried about
what's the toughest part? Because I know that in Tibet Autonomous Region, the compulsory educational years have already been extended to 12 years.
Yes. You know that the first one will be based on a very harsh situation after the earthquake of the Wenchuan. And maybe the certain would be some, we just accumulate some experience and practical ways to do some evaluation of these documents. And the third one at the present will be the best time and perfect one to based on some we just experience, and some of the we practice items or we do has matched. We have totally matched some of the targets in the 2015. Yeah.
So, Victor, what do you think is the toughest part?
Let me give you some examples. For example, the bifurcation of the Chinese society, that is dividing the Chinese society into the urban side of the equation versus the rural side of the equation. And as a result, many people who are classified as rural residents do not enjoy as much rights as the people in the urban side of the equation. This eventually need to be leveled off, and I think every citizen in China, regardless of where she or he lives, in cities or in countryside, need to enjoy the same rights,
yes,
political rights as well as economic rights. Secondly, I would say in China we have this tradition of classifying people by their nationalities or ethnic background. It is an important thing of grouping people according to their ethnic background. But eventually, I think, as we achieve high level of modernization, every citizen in China, regardless of your age, your gender, your educational background, your disability or not, for example, or your ethnic background, should be treated completely and absolutely equal. And that will require certain changes to the nationalities policies, because otherwise China is fragmented into different regions. Each region has its own focus, etc., with its own ethnic composition eventually. in the traditional society, it could work. In a modernized society, with high level of modernity, it will not work eventually. And this has a direct bearing on the so-called human rights, because eventually when we talk about human rights, it should be human rights provided on an equal basis to everyone in China, regardless of all the other distinguishing factors of the person involved. And that is the goal. We cannot achieve that overnight. We will take many years or even decades to achieve that goal. But in terms of the grand action plan, this should be envisioned. This should be, goals that we need to achieve down the road, even beyond the horizon as of today. But this should be the inspiration and the aspirations of the Chinese people.
Well, gentlemen, as we just mentioned, it's a global issue. So China, we know that China has conducted more than 20 human rights dialogues with major Western countries since 2012. What have all these dialogues achieved, Professor?
I think that we have shown the idea, the Chinese character's idea about the human rights. That's the first thing.
But do you see a decrease of false accusations against China?
Yes, of course. We just face some conflicts face to face. But I think that's it's initials to very necessary to get into the integration of international human rights society, especially communities of the human rights concepts. For example, I have been a candidate for the special report for the HRC mechanism. Even though I failed in this year, but I think that will be the first step we get into to show the ideas and show our how to do and how the human rights story are. We not just story. We just put everything into practice. How to tell the Chinese story very efficiently in the international communities.
Well, Victor, compared to actions, real actions, do you think dialogue with the Western countries can actually bridge differences between China and them?
The dialogue is always important, not only between China and the developed countries, but China with the emerging economies, with the developing countries. I think more dialogue, the better. On the other hand, there has been a very strong tendency, especially in certain developed countries, including in particular the United States, for example, who actually indulge in the fantasy that China is a country without human rights. China is a country where people do not care about human rights, and China is a country where the government does not provide protection to human rights. These are fantasies. I think their ideology and their way of thinking and their information are completely outdated. Come to China for a look. Talk to an ordinary Chinese citizen in China. For a population of 1.4 billion, you always have problems. You always have some people who are not very happy about themselves or about their circumstances, etc. But more or less, if you are very objective looking at this...
Yeah, talking about that, we start big, and I want to end this discussion small. You're both Chinese citizens, I believe.
Yes.
What's one issue about human rights that you concern the most, Professor?
The most issue I concern most is for the education for human rights, because we should increase a very strong environment for the
right.
For
what about you,
culture.
Victor?
Well, in China, it used to be a crime if you criticize the Chinese leaders or the Chinese government system, etc. In today's China, with the popularization of internet, mobile phone, etc., you can actually express your opinion, positive or negative, about almost everyone in China that you want to talk about.
And that's your personal concern. And you've already
whether
seen
people
improvement
care
in
about
field.
what you talk about, that's another matter.
Right.
But I think talking about things, with certain exceptions, of course, is no longer
Well, thank you
considered
very
a
much,
violation.
Victor.
This
Thank you
is
very
the
much.
increase in human rights.
Maybe we can also increase
That's
the
right.
common
Thank
sense
you very
based
much.
on human
Thank you
rights.
very much, gentlemen, for your input. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CCTV News. I'm Panding in Beijing. Bye-bye.